The first thing we want to do is set up some reference images. Mine is in the description, you can download them or just get your own reference. We also want to set up some sort of a guide for the dimension of the geometry. For that we can just use a plane, so add mesh plane and extrude it up 220 centimeters, as that is the overall height of the model. Going into the front orthographic, we can go to add image background, get the ref front, drag it up until it matches the base. Now, in order to scale it down from that origin point, we want to change the pivot into the 3D cursor. Alt-Z to go into X-ray mode so we can actually see how much we scale it down. S to scale, and we want the top of the model to match with our dimension guide. Wonderful. Now we can do the same on the right side. So going to right orthographic, add image background, this time the ref side. Same process, drag it all the way up. Now we also want the sphere to be centered, so we'll drag it on the y-axis. There we go. Now we can scale it down, just like we did with the front image. We don't need the dimension cage we made anymore, so we can just get rid of that. We can rename the images to ref side and ref front. The last thing we want to do before we start modeling is change the pivot point back to median. To keep things organized, I created a separate collection for the geometry and gave it a different color. Now, the first thing we want to model is probably the chair itself, which we will create out of a sphere. So add mesh UV sphere. 16 segments should be enough. Now we can drag it to be at the center. Alt-Z to go into X-ray view. And that should be it. Now we want to scale it down until it touches the edge on the side. Then scale it up on the Z-axis. Do some adjusting. Again, scale it down and scale it on the side and scale it up. That should be good enough. We can delete the faces at the top and then fill them. So face grid fill. Change the offset to make sure it aligns with the axis. And now we have a flat face at the top. We also want to do it at the bottom, but we'll delete a few more faces. Now we can select the edge loop at the bottom. Ctrl F, grid fill. Change the offset, and we have a flat face at the bottom as well. Now we want to delete the front faces to create the opening of the chair. So in X-ray mode, make sure we select both sides at the bottom as well, and just delete all the faces. Now we go into vertices selection and slide the vertices at the bottom to align with our shape. We also want to adjust the vertices at the top a little bit. Make sure the transition is a bit smoother. So let's drag it on the y-axis and scale it on the x-axis. The only thing left to do is go into the modifier tab and add a solidify modifier and set it to 3 centimeters. That should be good with the reference. And that is the main part of the chair. In order to create the cushion for the chair, we want to start by applying the solidify modifier and selecting the bottom faces of the inside part of the chair. Now, if we go into the front view and set it to X-ray mode, we can see how high we need to go with our cushion. And we want to select the faces on both the left and the right side of the chair. So select everything. Then we can just Shift D to duplicate, right click to make sure that it doesn't move, P to separate by selection. Now we have 2 separate models. We can add a solidify modifier to that one as well. This time it would be more like 6, and the offset would be +1. We want to apply that modifier as well, and while selecting both of them, go into the front view and delete half. That would make things a little bit easier later when we are going to bevel and then unwrap it. So make sure that both of those have a mirror modifier with clipping. If we go into the item tab, we can see the scale is a bit off, so we can apply the scale on both of those models and set it to 1. We can also start renaming things at this point, but I am just going to combine everything at the end, so I will rename it then. Now, in order to make the chain, we want to start at the top. So if we go into edit mode, we can select the center vertex, Shift S and cursor to selected. Going into the side view, you can zoom in a little bit and Shift A, add mesh circle. 16 segments should be enough, and the radius would be more like 10. Going into edit mode, we can extrude it up until it reaches the correct height. Extrude again, this time scale it in, and extrude it up again. Great. Now we want to close that shape, so going into edit mode, going into edge mode, we can press Ctrl F, grid fill, change the offset again to make sure it aligns with the axis. Do the same at the bottom, and that is it. Again, select the center vertex, Shift S, cursor to selected. And we can start by extruding again, but it would make more sense to just use E torus, as it has the correct shape already. Change the major segments to 16. Rotate on the y-axis to 90 degrees. And change the major radius. That should be about 3. And the minor radius maybe 0.5. Zoom in to make sure if that works properly. If we drag it up to align it, that seems to be in the correct size. So now we can Shift D to duplicate it, rotate on the Z-axis and drag it up. Drag it up a little bit more. We have those two links in the chain. We can duplicate them once. Make sure they are aligned properly. Duplicate and drag up one more time. And this top link, maybe we can drag it all a little bit down to make sure it aligns at the top a little bit better. Select just the link at the top, delete the top half of it, and we might as well delete the right side, as we are going to use the mirror modifier. The mirror is currently pointing up, and that is because we need to reset or apply the rotation. Now we can select the vertices or the edges at the top. E to extrude, S to scale. E to extrude again, this time we are going to extrude up. And close the shape. One more thing we want to do. In order to complete this shape, we want to duplicate it, drag it down, and rotate it on the y-axis 180 degrees. In order to snap it to the base of the chain, we want to change the snap mode to vertex, G, Z, Control to snap it. Now it seems the chain is now a bit too low. So again, we can just drag it up, and that is our chain complete. The only thing we have left now is the base. So let's put the 3D cursor back in the origin point. Shift S, cursor toward the origin. Shift A, add mesh circle. This time we will leave it at the default vertices, but the radius should be smaller, so set it to 50. If we go into the side view, we can see it lines up pretty nicely with the reference we have. So now we can go into edit mode and extrude it up. After we extruded it, we can go into the modifiers and add a solidify modifier. Change the offset to +1 and the thickness to maybe 5. That should be enough. Apply the modifier, and now we can select the two faces at the back. So we can start extruding them. E to extrude, straight ahead, then S to scale, Y to scale it on the Y-axis, and 0 to flatten it. Now all we have to do is extrude, move, and rotate to follow the shape. So let's move those faces, rotate them, move it a little bit more into position, and repeat the process. Extrude, move, rotate, and move again. Extrude, rotate, move. Extrude, rotate, move until we get to the end. One last extrude, we can just extrude it straight on the Y axis until we get to the end of the shape. Now if we go into X-ray and select the bottom vertices, we can make sure they line up with the base of the chain. We can also drag it up a little bit more. One final tweak we want to do to the base. So we want to select the right side and delete it. Then again, add a mirror modifier with clipping. We also want to select all those vertices we made on the side and drag them all toward the center. Wonderful. We also want to get that face that is just off the center, extrude it on the X-axis, and delete it. One more thing that we want to do is select that middle face, extrude it straight ahead, in X-ray mode we can select the one edge that got hidden and slide it out. Now we can create one edge loop that we will snap, G, X, and Ctrl snap it. Then another edge loop, G, X, Ctrl snap, and we can delete the inner faces and also those side faces that will give us a hole. We can select 1 and 2 edge loops. With the Loop Tools add-on, we can just bridge them, and that is the base complete. Now that we modeled all the different parts of the chair, we can start doing some cleanup. So we can take the reference folder and delete it. We are not going to use it anymore. In the Overlay tab, we can check face orientation, and it looks like the base of the chain need to be flipped. So in edit mode, we can select all of it and Shift N to recalculate normals. Now it is blue and we are good to go. We can turn off the face orientation. The last thing we want to do here is smooth it. So if we go into the first link in the chain, right click Shade Smooth, and we can do that to all the other links as well. When we get to the base, we can go into local view, isolate it, and select all the outside corner edges. Make sure we select all of them, and then Control B to bevel. We want the segments at 2, so it will give us a middle edge, which will be easier when we make the seams. And width should be more like 0.05. That is strong enough. Now we can do Shade Smooth and do exactly the same with the one at the top. So go into local view, edit mode, select the edges on the outside, Control B to bevel, and set the width to 0.05. Then Shade Smooth. And those are all the links. Now we want the base of the chain, pretty much the same process. Select all the edges, everything on the outside, on both sides. Control B to bevel, and this time it is a bigger object, so we can go to 0.25, and that should be good enough. Shade Smooth, exit local view, and the chain is now ready for unwrapping. We'll do the same with the chair and the stand. So in edge mode, we select all the outside edges, all the border edges that we are going to bevel. We also want to select the edges at the bottom to give it a bit more definition. Control B and to 0.25. Shade Smooth. If we use the subdivision modifier, we can see that it's working without any issues, which is exactly what we want. So we'll do the same with the cushion. Isolate it, select all the corner edges, the one at the bottom as well, and bevel it. 0.25. Now Shade Smooth, and that is it. The only part left is the stand. So if we go into edit mode, and we can start at the bottom. First we'll select the edge loops on the outside, and then all the loops on the inside, both at the top and the bottom. We also want those edges that connect the base of the stand to the rest of it, and then just select those two edge loops. That will get us most of the way to the top. 1, 2, 3 edges left. Control B, 0.25, and Shade Smooth. Now that is the modeling part complete, and now we can move on to unwrapping and texturing. So in order to do the unwrapping, we are going to start with the cushion. We are going to isolate it, go to edit mode, and now we can use the edges we made with the bevel in order to quickly select all those corner edges that we want to mark as seams. It takes us all the way to the bottom, and here we can select that edge loop as well, and the one on the inside. You make seams. There we go. We also want to cut it in the middle, so we can select that little edge, control click to drag it up, and control click again to drag it down. We'll do the same on the back, control click to drag it up, control click again, and one final time. You mark seams, and at this point we can apply the mirror modifier, so we have the seams on both sides. Exit the local view, and now do the same with the chair itself. We can zoom in a little bit, select that middle edge loop we made. We also want that edge loop of the top and the one on the side as well. If we go down, again we want to select those bottom edges, just like we did with the cushion. You mark seams and select the middle edges so we can have a clean cut. Do the same at the top and at the back. So we want those two edges as well. And now if we go all the way down, control click, you mark seam, apply the mirror modifier, and that is the chair and the cushion unwrapped. Now in order to unwrap the chain, we're going to start with the base, isolate it, and again we are going to select all those middle edges that we made, mark them as seams, you mark seam, and if we go to the back view, we can select those three and those three and mark them as well. That is complete. We can exit local view and do the same with the first link that we have, this half link, which is a bit more complicated in its shape, but again we have the bevel. We can just select all those middle edges, and if we go to the inside, we can select the three at the bottom and the three on the main part as well. You mark seam, exit local view, and we can apply the mirror modifier. Of course we want clipping as well. Now we can just do the same on this link, or just delete it. Take the link we already made with seams, Shift D to duplicate it, RY 180, flip it, and then just snap it to the top. Now the other links in the chain are much more simple. We only need to select two edge loops, the one in the middle here and the one on the inside. You mark seam and do the same to all the other links. And that is it. That is all of them. And now we can move on to the stand. So now we can select the stand, zoom in a little bit. In edit mode, we can just select all those edges we made, and it should take us most of the way to the ground. There we go. Now we also want to select that edge loop to separate the main part from the base of the stand. And then we also want to select all the inner edges. To make that easier, we'll mark those seams right away. And then we'll go on the inside, on the top, and the bottom, and also the middle edges. We can't forget them. So that is one. Now the next one, the top, the bottom, one corner edge. We have 3 corners in here, so let's select the second one as well. There we go, and the last edge we have there, a bit difficult as we can't really zoom in anymore, so we can just mark the seams and then zoom in on that. 1, 2, 3 edges, mark seams, and the last few, the top, the bottom, and that one corner edge loop. Mark that seam as well. Apply the mirror modifier, and that is all the different parts unwrapped. After we finished unwrapping everything, now would be a good time to just select all the objects, Ctrl J, and combine them. Now we also want to rename it. Let's call it chair. And in the object data properties, we want to rename that as well. After we named it, we can then go into the UV editing tab, select everything, zoom in on it so we can see it a little bit better in the 3D view, U, and unwrap. I like to set the margin to 0.002 just to give it a little bit more room, and overall that will do an okay job, but the one thing we do want to change is the stand on the left and the right side. We want it to be completely straight. So we can select all of it in the UV editor, rotate it a little bit, then we can take that middle face. In edge mode we can press S, Y, 0 to flatten it at the top. We'll do the same at the bottom, S, Y, 0. And then on the side it would be S, X, 0. On the right side and on the left side. Then we can select that face, L to select the rest of this part, right click and follow active quads. Now that part is completely straight, which is exactly what we want. We'll do the same on the left side as well, so select that. Select it in the UV editor as well, rotate it a little bit, then pick a face. We can flatten it again at the top and the bottom, scale it on the Y axis and the X axis on the right side and the left side as well. Select that face, L to select the rest of the faces, follow active quads. Now, if we press A to select everything, we can see it overlaps a little bit. So we can select those two parts we just made and move them to the side. The unwrapping of the model is now complete and we are ready for export. In order to make the selection of the textures a little bit easier in Substance, we are going to create an ID map for our model. So if we go into Edit mode and go into Vertex Selection, we want to make sure that at first we only select the cushion. And then if we go into Vertex Paint and enable the Vertex Selection view, we can pick a color like green, Shift K to color the entire part. And we'll do the same with the rest of the model as well. In Edit mode, we can select the chair, go back to Vertex Paint, give it another color, maybe yellow, yellowish green color. Then we can select all the different parts of the chain, as they are likely to have the same material. In Vertex Paint, we can give them a red color. Then the last part, the stand, we can select it, and in Vertex Paint, we can maybe give it a blue color. Shift K to color all of it. And that is the ID map complete. We can go into Object mode and export it as is, but I prefer to make a duplicate, hide the original, give the duplicate a subdivision modifier of 1 and apply that. Just so it is a little bit smoother when we work on it in Substance. Then we can go ahead and export it as an FBX file so that Substance will be able to read the vertex color. Now that we are in Substance Painter, we can go to File, New, and select our model. Share FBX. Document resolution can be at 1K, I prefer to do it on 2K. And change the normal map format to OpenGL. Okay, and let the model load. There we go, we have the UV and the 3D view, wonderful. Now we can go into texture set settings, bake mesh maps. Again, we want to change it to 2K, and the ID map should be vertex color, as this is what we made. Bake selected textures. And once it is done, we can go back to the Layers tab, delete this default layer, and we can get to work. So the first material we will make is the chair and the stand. So we'll start with a fill layer, name that base, and if we go to our material attributes, the only thing I want to change is the color, give it more like a brownish orangey color. We can still change that later on if we need to. Then I am going to press Ctrl D to duplicate. Alt click on the color to make sure that is the only active channel. Rename that to color 1. And change the color to be a lot darker and more saturated. So almost black, very, very dark color. Then we can add a black mask, right click, And then if we right click on the mask itself, we can add a fill layer. And if we go into the texture options, any of the directional noise will do a good job. I will go with directional noise 2. And it's already given us the desired effect, but the projection is not very ideal. So in this case, we can change the projection to a spherical projection, which kind of twisted things around, but that is because the sphere is kind of at the center of the model rather than in the center of the sphere. So we can just drag it out until it's at the proper place. There we go, and now the texture is working properly, but it's only working properly on the chair. The stand will need some changes. So the first thing we'll do is put that in a folder. So just create a new folder, select the base and the color variation, drag that in, call that chair. Right click, add a black mask, right click, add a color selection, and now we can just pick the color of the ID map, and we have the chair itself selected. Now we can Ctrl D to duplicate it, name that stand 1, and clear the mask. Now we want to go to the mesh selection and go into mesh fill and fill the whole mesh. So it's still looking pretty weird, but that is because we need to change the projection method of the directional noise back to the UV projection. And now it is working. Or rather, it's working on the front and the back, but not on the side. If we take a look at the base, again, this side is the issue. So what we are going to do, we are going back into the mesh selection and we are going to go into the UV chunk fill. Press X to change it to deselect, and now it should be good. Wonderful, we can remove all the problematic areas. We can also do the same on the inside here. We have quite a few segments that we need to texture with that. So what we can do is duplicate that. And this one, it will be stand 2. We can clear the mask. And press X again to make sure the color is back at 1. And we are selecting things again. So we will select all the parts that we wanted. And at first, it seems that nothing really changed. But after we fill everything, we can go back to the directional noise and rotate its direction. So it will work the way that we want it to work. So if we go into the folder itself, into the black mask of the darker color, in the noise direction, we can set the rotation to 90. And now it's going sideways like it should. And if we go all the way up, we can see it's working. And that is the base material for the chair and the stand. We can put all of those in a folder and call that wood. And now we can move on to the other materials. Before we move on to other materials, we just want to make sure that we have our selection, UV chunk fill, and that we really manage to select everything, all the different parts that we want to. Okay, so to make the material for the chain, I am just going to go over to the Smart Materials and get the brushed aluminum. Add a black mask, add a color selection, and pick the red color. And that is it. Now we also want to make the material for the cushion. So again, we are just going to go with a base layer and give it a color which kind of have the same brown tone, but this time I am going to make it brighter and less saturated. So just a hint of color in there. There we go. Now to make it look a bit better, I am just going to use a material I downloaded from Ambient CG. I am going to use the Fabric 48 as it gives a pretty nice effect for what we want. So just add the material, add resources, and go to wherever we put our material. In this case, I am just going to use the normal GL and the roughness. Open both of them, set them to texture, and I will just put it in the current session. Import. We have those two images, and we can just drag them to the right place. So roughness to roughness, and the normal to normal. Doesn't look that great now. We can change the projection to spherical projection and drag it to the right place. Now we also want to create a new folder for that, and this one will be the shell, and add a black mask, add a color selection, and pick the cushion. That should be cushion, not shell. And that is the material. Maybe we can make it even more desaturated. And those are the base materials, and we can leave it like that. Or we can also add a little bit more variation to it. In order to give the model a little bit more variation, we are going to give it some damage, some wear and tear, and we are going to start with the aluminum. So if we go into the normal materials, we can get the rust fine, put it on top, and then add a black mask. Now we only want a little bit of damage on it. So we can go into the Smart Mask tab and get the rust. There we go. Now that's a bit too much. So if we go into the mask editor, we can scale it down. 0.75 is a bit too much, so maybe 0.5 or even 0.35. There we go. So just a little bit of damage, just a hint that something is going on there. So that is the aluminum, and now we can get the cushion. So if we duplicate it, Control D, change the projection back to UV projection, and name that Dirt 1. we only want the color and the roughness. We also don't want the texture of the fabric for this one, so we can cancel that and disable the metalness, the normal, and the height. Now the first dirt layer that we want to have it quite dark, so we can just drag the value down and maybe make it a bit more saturated. Close that. Now it's very, very shiny, which is not what we want. So we can change the roughness to 0.8. It needs to be very high for a dirt effect. Now we can add a black mask. And this time we are going to use a fill layer. Change the projection to triplanar. And for the projection itself, we are going to use a grunge map of sort. The cobweb has a very nice effect on it, but again, it's a bit too strong and also a bit too straight. So we can change the rotation to maybe 45. That looks pretty decent. And the balance can be maybe 0.25, maybe even 0.1, lower than that, or 0.05. So it's barely there. It is still quite strong, so we can change the opacity, put it at maybe like 70, or even 50. So it's there, but it's kind of faded. We don't want the effect to be too strong. Now we can duplicate that same layer, so again, Ctrl D. Change the opacity back to 100 so we can see the effect better. This one will be dirt 2. And we want it to be brighter. So we want to change the value and even make it less saturated. Okay, now if we go into the black mask, we can delete the fill layer. Instead of adding a new fill layer or generator, we are going back to the smart masks and add the rust again. So it does give us this nice effect. And similar to the aluminium, we want to reduce it down to maybe 0.3 or maybe even 0.15. So it's barely there. It blends in. And again, we can turn the opacity down to 50. Right, so it is there, just not very noticeable. Now, we also want to add a dirt layer for the chair itself, so we can close the cushion layer, the cushion folder, and open the wood folder. And we can go to stand 2, Ctrl C to copy the base layer, Ctrl V to paste it on top of all the other layers. We can call that dirt 1. And we want it to be quite desaturated. So just a hint of color in there. Maybe make it brighter as well. There we go. So it's almost gray, but still have a little bit of color in it. We also want the roughness to be high, so maybe like 0.8. We can turn off the height, metalness, and normal. We don't need them in this case. Right click to add a black mask. And in the smart mask, we can pick dirt ground. So it does a nice work at the bottom of the chair, but it is very, very strong. So if we go into the mask builder, we can play with the levels, so maybe 0.2, or maybe even 0.15. It still gives us quite a lot of dirt on the inside, which we don't really want. So what we can do to edit that mask a little bit more, we can just add a paint layer. And if we go into the brushes, we can pick a nice brush, maybe Dirt 1. It tends to work pretty well. And if we press X, we will now remove some of that layer, some of that mask, instead of adding. So probably the area that touches the cushion won't have as much dirt to it. We can scale the brush down a bit, kind of randomly remove parts of it. It doesn't need to be perfect. We just want to break down some of it, most of it, and make sure that it is pretty clean, but not completely clean. We also want to edit some of it at the bottom. Right? It doesn't have to cover the bottom of the chair completely. There we go. And if we go to the right side, it seems pretty good. Now the base of the stand also is not going to have so much of that dirt on it. We can scale down the brush even more to make it a little bit easier. So on the edges we will see some build-up, but on the inside not so much. We can just remove it in random places, in some more than others. We can even add a little bit if we want to. Okay, and now the kind of the main part of the stand. We don't want to have the dirt so much in this middle area. We will have something else in there. So we can get rid of pretty much all of it, or at least most of it. And as we go down, we'll remove less and less. Right, so remove it on just random spots. Break down the straight lines. Now it is still a bit strong in terms of the color, so we can go to the opacity setting and reduce it down to maybe like 75 or even 50. So again, it's just there, but it's not too strong. And we can edit that even more if we need to. So toggle the add and remove by using the X, just to make sure that we get the effect that we want. Now we also want to add a new fill layer, and this one would be rough one, as it's only going to affect the roughness. But to make sure we're able to see it at the beginning, we'll add the color channel. And again, we want the roughness to be high to 0.8 or 0.9, so it has quite a contrast. And we can also hide the Dirt 1 layer for now, just to make it a little bit easier to see what's going on. So if you go into Black Mask and add a fill layer, if we go to the textures, this time we want something more like fingerprints. So the fingerprint smear wide might work just fine, and we will set the projection to triplanar. Okay, now again, it covers pretty much the entire model, and it's not what we want, so we can change the balance to 0.4, and now we barely see it. So we can go to the scale and change the tiling to 2. And now we see it a little bit more in some random spots. And similar to the dirt layer, we want to add a paint layer and start adding in some places, removing in other places. Mostly we want to break down those straight lines. We don't want a lot of it at the bottom of the chair, but we do want it like on the sides where people might touch it, right? So we can play with the add and remove. Go to the right side, and again, we want to break down those straight lines, make them look a bit more organic. That looks okay. We also want to make sure that on the inside we remove some of it as well. Probably not going to touch the top so much, more the sides. And the stand, we probably are not going to touch the top so much. So we can remove a lot of that. But we will touch the sides. And again, we can scale it down to make sure that it's a bit easier to work on. This is the place that we are not going to touch, or that we are less likely to touch when we move this chair around. We might touch here at the base. And unless we are pushing it, probably the front will not have so many fingerprints on it. Now we can go back to the layer itself, disable the color channel, and if we rotate the light around, we can see we have some spots of roughness that should give us this effect that people were touching it. We also probably want something in the back of the stand, so we can go back to the paint layer and keep messing with that, keep editing it. Again, we can disable the color channel and see the effect that we have. If that is too strong, we can dial it back to maybe 0.8 or 0.75. So it's a bit softer. We can also add the dirt one and see how they work together. And that is the dirt added to the wood texture. One last thing we want to do in Substance before we actually export the texture is add a little bit of light variation as if this chair was exposed to the sun. We can do it simply by adding a new fill layer, alt-click on the color, as this is the only channel that we want, and we want to give it a little bit of a yellow color. About that much. There we go. We can also rename it, call it light. Right click to add a black mask, and this time add a generator. In the generators we have light. And the default angle looks pretty solid to me, so I am going to keep it as is, but there is also the option to play with the horizontal and the vertical angle to change the direction of the sun. So if the light mainly comes from the back, you can set it to the back. But again, I am going to leave it as is. The only thing I do want to change is the intensity because the color is way too strong. So I'm going to reduce it to a very, very low amount, maybe 10. So it is just barely there. It does a pretty good job of giving a little bit more color to those areas. And with that done, all that is left to do is go to File, Export Textures, select the correct folder, and export. After we exported the texture set from Substance, we want to import it into Blender so we can see it in our viewport. And at this point we can just delete this high poly chair and go back to our original chair. In the material properties we can make a new material and rename that MAT for material and chair. Now if we go into the Shading tab, we can click on the Principled BSDF, and if we have the Node Wrangler add-on, so if we go into the add-on preferences, Node Wrangler, we can select the material, Ctrl-Shift-T, and in our texture folder, we can select all the images, and Blender will sort them out automatically. Now Blender applied the materials, and if we go back into the Layout tab, we can see we have our material in Blender with the little bit of dirt and damage that we applied to it, and that is the texturing part complete. The last thing we want to do with this chair is give it a simple rig. And we start by going to the Scene collection and add a new collection. This one will be the armature, and we can also give it a color. Now the cursor is already at the origin point, so we can just go ahead and create a new armature. So add armature single bone. We will rename the armature to armature chair, and we can scale the bone down. The size of it doesn't really matter all that much. Now we want to go to the chain itself, and it might be easier in the shaded view. If we go into edit mode and select the edge loop of the top link, Shift S cursor to selected. If we go back to the armature, Shift A to create a new bone, and scale that down as well. We are going to duplicate it, Shift D, and then drag it up on the Z axis. Now this one, we are going to rotate it 180 degrees so that it points down. And now we are going to select the model again, select this time the edge loop of the second link in the chain, Shift S cursor to selected, select the armature again, Shift S selection to cursor. And we are going to repeat this process, select the next link in the chain, set the cursor, and then snap the new bone to the cursor. So select the next link, Shift S cursor to selected, go back to edit mode, go to the armature, edit mode, extrude, Shift S selection to cursor, and the process repeats itself all the way down. Now we can select all of them, press Alt and click on the roll, then set all of them to 0. And with this last one, we can just extrude one more time straight down. Set the roll of the bone to 0. And up here at the top, we want to create one more bone, and again, drag that up. And those are all the bones we are going to need for this armature. Now, in order to make this rig a little bit easier to deal with, we want to rename all of the bones that we have. So we start with this first bone, that would be the root bone. Then the two at the top, we will have the bone chair control, CTRL. And this one will be bone border. So that will be the border of the chair control. Then we have the bone chains, so bone chain 1, bone chain 2, bone chain 2, bone chain 3, bone chain 4, bone chain 5, and this one is bone chair. So now that we renamed all of the bones, we also want to parent the chair control, the border, and the bone chain 1 to the root bone. So Control P, parent and keep offset. And then we want to parent the chair itself to the armature. So select the chair, shift select the armature, Control P, and parent with empty groups. Then if we go to the Object Data Properties, and in Edit mode, in the vertex selection, we can assign the bones pretty easily. So for the root bone, we really want just the stand and the top of the chain. Assign that. Then we can just go down the chain and assign each individual link. So this one is bone chain 1, bone chain 2, bone chain 3, bone chain 4, bone chain 5, and for the chair we're going to select the bottom link, the base of the chain, the chair itself, and the cushion. Assign them all to the chair, and that is our model parented. If we go now into pose mode, Control Tab, the root is controlling everything. Currently the chair control and the border don't do anything, but the chain can move around pretty easily. So instead of having to rotate every single bone in our chain, we can use this driver to control all of them. And the first thing we want to do is change the rotation mode on the chain bones to XYZ order. Then we need to figure out how we want to move this control. So we want to use the location of the control to control the rotation of the chain. So if we move it on the x-axis, we need to figure out how much we want to move it. So let's say maybe 20 centimeters on each side. So we can add the constraint, limit location, minimum and maximum of the x-axis. We also want affect transform and change it to local space. We want to change the minimum to -20 and the maximum to 20. Now if we move it on the x-axis, it is locked to those values. So let's move it all the way to 20 and select the first bone in the chain. While the control bone is moving from side to side, in order to rotate the chain, we want it on the local Z-axis. So, right-click on the Z-axis, add driver. Show in driver editor. And if we select it, we can change the expression to VAR and select the object, in this case the armature chair, and the bone should be the bone chair control. While we do want the X location of the bone, we want to change the space to the local space. And it's rotating from side to side, but it's rotating in the wrong direction. So if we go into the F curve, we want to make the value negative. And we don't want it to rotate all that much, so we can put it at -5. And currently the Z-axis is set to 1. And that is because of the keyframe. So the keyframe 1 would be 100 centimeters or 1 meter. And because we only move the control 20 centimeters, the keyframe should be at 0.2. And now our value is at 5. So if we close that and move the control bone, we can see it's moving from side to side. Now the next thing we want to do is copy that driver and paste it on all the other bones in the chain. And we can see that all of them are moving individually. And again, let's move the control from side to side, and it gives us a better swinging motion. Alt-G to reset the location, and now we want it to move front and back. So that would be the Z-axis. So it would be pretty much the same process. Add a driver, this time on the X-axis, as this would be the front and back rotation. Edit the driver, show in driver editor. At this point we can hide the Z driver. We only want to focus on the X. Again, change the expression to VAR. The object, we can select the armature chair, and in the bone we want the control bone. This time, instead of the X location, we want the Z location, and change the space to local space. The F curve, the value would be 5, and the keyframe would be 0.2. Now if we move the control from front to back, again it's working, but in the reverse way, so we need to flip that. And if we go back to our first bone in the chain, edit driver, show in driver editor, and in the F curve we will change the value to -5. Now if we move it, it's moving as intended. And then, exactly as we did with the Z-axis driver, we will copy the X-axis driver and paste it to all the other bones. Now, if we move that around, front and back works fine. So we also want to limit the Z-axis in the same way as the X-axis, so -20 and +20. The Y location, we can just lock it at 0. And now we can just play around with it. So those are the drivers we needed to have, and now all that's left to do is a little bit of cleanup. In order to start cleaning up the scene, the first thing we are going to do is press Ctrl-Tab to go back to Object Mode, and in the Scene collection we'll create a new collection. This one will be the Custom Shapes. We can give that one a color as well. And in order to create the Custom Shapes, I am going to use the Orient Bone Shapes add-on. Download link is in the description. We are going to start by resetting the cursor, Shift-S, cursor to world origin, Shift-A, mesh, and a circle. The number of vertices doesn't matter all that much, can be at the default. Rename that to CS, custom shape. Root. And once we activated the add-on, can shift select the armature, Ctrl-Tab to go to pose mode and select the root bone. Right click, set and align bone shape. Ctrl-Tab to go back to object mode, and we can just hide the custom shape for the root. The second custom shape that we want is for the border, but we want it at the center of the chair control. So we can select the chair control, Shift-S, cursor to selected, and because the control bone only moved 20 centimeters, we want to create a plane which is 40 centimeters, so it will be 20 centimeters on each side. In edit mode we can select the face, and then if we go to delete only faces, go to the top view, Shift D to duplicate, S to scale, let's say by 1.5. We can also bridge some of those vertices to give it a bit of a more noticeable shape. Rename that CS border. Shift select the armature, Ctrl-Tab to go into pose mode, select the border bone, and again right click, set and align bone shape. Ctrl-Tab to go to object mode, hide that custom shape as well. And the last bone we want to create a custom shape for is this control bone. So we already have the cursor where we want it. We can just Shift A, mesh, and circle. Make sure it's very small, so 10, maybe even 5. Duplicate it in edit mode, Shift D, and then drag it up a little bit, and then do it again. Doesn't have to be precise in any way. Then we can rename that one as well, CS chair control. Shift select the armature, go into pose mode with Ctrl-Tab, select that control bone, right click, set and align bone shape. Ctrl-Tab to go back to object mode, and we can just hide the entire custom shapes collection. We don't really need it anymore. Another thing that we don't need is the bones for the chain. We have the control bone to control all of them, so we can just press M and move them to a different layer. We can also press Shift S and reset the cursor back to the world origin. And the last thing we really have to do here is give the bones color. So if we go into the object data properties and into bone groups, we can select all 3 bones that we have and assign them to a new group. Click assign again. We can name that group yellow, or just leave it as group, doesn't matter all that much. Give it the yellow color, and then if we go to the custom color set, we can set them all to the same yellow tone, and the active one, we will set it to red, so it will be easier to recognize which one we are selecting. And that is pretty much it. Now the border bone is pretty much only there for show, to help us see where the control bone has its limits. And it's not even necessary to have that. So we use the control bone to rotate the chair around, and the root bone to control the whole model. We can start playing around with it. And that is our hanging chair complete.